Hello again everybody, and a very warm welcome back to the channel. Today, another episode in our ATR 42 and 72 tutorial series that hopefully you guys have all been enjoying what's been created thus far. Share your tips, tricks down in the comments below, and of course hit like and subscribe as well if you're joining us on board for the very first time. Today we're going to be answering a question that's become more frequent over the last couple of days. I've decided to do a tutorial video specifically about the issue of trim. There's been a couple of conversations inside our Discord server where people have been struggling with trimming the ATR. That's primarily because it's very different to the likes of anything we've flown before. Say for example the Airbus A320 with its fly-by-wire system, and the fact that it assists you with trim throughout the flight anyway. So we're going to go through a couple of basics. The principles also apply to things like the Piper PA-28, the Cessna 152, all the way up to the PMDG 737, so on and so forth. So it's just the basics of trim that we're going to be focusing on today, in effect, to help you guys fly more accurately and get to grips with the controls of the ATR more comfortably. So, what different trimmable controls do we have on the ATR? First and foremost, down the bottom on the pedestal, we've got aileron trim, and below that, rudder trim. There's also a standby pitch trim selector knob here too. For takeoff, you want to make sure your rudder trim is set to neutral, and your aileron trim is set neutral as well. And you can see the figures here accordingly. Currently, because we're in auto flight, the aeroplane is pitching and changing the elevator trim itself automatically through the autoflight system or the autopilot. A lot of people are messing up on approach with this. Once they get the autopilot off and the yaw damper comes off, the controls are ours to manipulate, and that's where a very carefully managed approach with a good trim is vital. So I'm not too worried about aileron or rudder trim today. If you have them beyond 0 for a takeoff roll, you might find you'll probably crash, or the controls will become very difficult to manage and maintain throughout your takeoff, or even the landing as well. It's worth monitoring them through the flight anyway. But you can see on the center display here, display unit 3, that they're both set to neutral anyway, both aileron and rudder trim. We're level at 6,000 feet. And we're about to hit a discontinuity, which is going to then mean that the aeroplane goes to heading mode. But we're going to take the autopilot off, set a thrust setting to about 220 or so knots. There's our warning, because it's reverted to heading select mode with the discontinuity. And before we turn the autopilot off, I'm just going to try and set a speed to around 220 that we can hold nice and stable. We're not going to worry about chasing it. We're in a little bit of turbulent weather at the moment anyway, so it's going to bounce about a little bit, which does make it a bit tricky to trim the aeroplane. One big rule here is making sure that we don't trim during anything that might be transient. So, for example, we roll the aeroplane left, it's pointless trimming in the turn, because when we roll wings level again, we'll need to entirely retrim again for straight and level flight. Same with pitch. If we're going to be manipulating the pitch, either up or down, get the nose up or down, then it's pointless trimming until we are at the pitch that we want to hold and the correct speed, and then we trim for it. If you're chasing it, or you're trimming whilst pitching, or trimming whilst rolling the aeroplane in a bank left or right, you'll find that you're constantly battling the trim. That's not what trim is for. So, about 218 knots, we're wings level at 6,000 feet, autopilot off. And you can see, beyond a little bit of left roll, the aeroplane is trimmed quite nicely here, because the auto flight system has pitched the trim for us. To show you guys the control inputs on the left, you can see that I'm not touching the controls, but we are holding speed and pitch quite nicely. Just having to put a little bit of right aileron in every now and again just to fight the winds. Again, if we were to roll, keeping the aeroplane balanced, we roll the wings level again. Release the controls. And just a little bit of right aileron just to help us. I mean, we could, in theory, with this, pop in a little bit of right aileron trim just to help hold the wings straight and level. But we're focusing really on pitch and elevator trim because that is primarily what we're going to be worrying about and tweaking and fiddling with the most. So that is straight and level flight, and then holding a pitch, rolling, wings level, allowing the aeroplane to settle again. We're not changing the pitch trim just yet. However, we reduce the power setting and we bring that throttle down. The nose is going to start to drop, and you can see now the vertical speed indicator is showing that we are on a negative vertical speed as we begin to descend. So this is the important one for approach. We're going to look at it as we fly an ILS back into Diagoras in a short while. But if we then apply thrust, we go back to notch, holding the wings level to prevent that roll of the aileron, watching that vertical speed needle. Look at that. And it's going to now allow the aeroplane's nose to come up slightly because we pitch to be at around 6,000 feet. We trim to be at around 6,000 feet at around 220 knots. On that basis, we can aim to level off around there. And if we have to, we'll retrim a little bit. So how about pitching in a climb? It's not likely to be something we're going to want to do. I'm just going to let the nose come down a little bit, let the speed come up a tad. Okay, so now we find ourselves in a little bit of positive pitch, trimming accordingly. And now I let go of the controls. A little bit of right aileron required. We'll have to manage the power and the speed as appropriate. Okay, so now I've climbed a little higher. It's about 7,500 feet roughly. Okay, so now I've climbed to about 7,000 feet. I've brought the speed down to about 180 knots. Okay, so about 7,000 feet now, 180 knots. So I'm going to let the nose begin to come down. Just a little bit of forward pitch. We're flying back towards roads now. And we're going to target roughly an idle descent. So similar to what we would have on the approach. So at the moment I'm having to use a little bit of forward stick, pushing forwards on the yoke just to try and hold that nose down a little bit. But instead we keep trimming until it settles where we want it to, which is about there. Now, as you can see on the left hand side, the control surface indications, so you can see what inputs I'm making on my controls here. We're holding a nice pitch and a decent rate of descent on idle here without me touching the controls at all. Now, because I've pitched for a descent, if I wanted to go wings level at say 4,000 feet and fly straight and level, power attitude trim, same rules as that of say a Cessna or a PA-28. Bring the nose up to roll out roughly where we want it to. We let it settle because we might not have the correct amount of power set for the cruise at 4,000 or to fly nice and straight and level at 4,000-ish. And then we want to kind of see what the aeroplane's doing. It's really difficult in a simulator because you can't feel the controls. You can't feel the aeroplane pitching down or pitching up. Instead we have to rely on basically just what we're seeing, which is not ideal. And I'm just tickling the pitch trim at the moment. There we are, back to 4,000. So, level at 4. Pointless trimming immediately because you can see on the left hand side the throttle, we're still tweaking that because the speed keeps jumping slightly until now. So I'm just using a little bit of downward trim. Perfect, now my hands are off. A little bit of right aileron still just to hold her steady. And there we are, 4,000 feet, 200-ish knots, straight and level flight. So over descent, attitude, power, and then when it's settled, trim. For leveling off, power, attitude, let it settle, trim. To go from here to a climb, power, attitude, let it settle, trim. To level off, attitude, at the right speed, power, trim. Let's head back, we'll do an ILS approach and consolidate all of this. So, as we make our way back to Rhodes Diagras International, we're going to be flying this, the ILS Zulu Runway 24 approach. We're not going to worry about the technicalities of the ILS itself, we're just going to focus on trim to hand fly the entire approach for the ILS. Again, pitching down, we're looking at attitude, power, then trim. So attitude first, then power, then trim. If we're going to level off for any reason, power, attitude, trim. Some of the big things here on approaches that people slip up with. Understandably so, it's a bit kind of counter-intuitive. If you want to reduce your rate of descent, so say for example your rate of descent is 800 feet per minute, you want to reduce that slightly to prevent you sinking below the glide path. You need to still hold the pitch where you're at, but apply power, and that will actually reduce the rate of descent for you. Conversely, to increase or decrease your speed, you change pitch. The idea of trimming the aircraft on approach when you're in hand flight, manual flight, at any point during the approach, is to take the pressure off you when there's a lot of other things going on. So by trimming the aeroplane nicely with the elevator trim, it reduces the need for you to constantly make pitch inputs to maintain a nice descent down towards the threshold. And it will then give you time to manage all the other things going on, certainly as a single person in a flight simulator flying a complex airliner. Okay, so starting to establish now on the ILS approach. What we're going to do is allow it to go wings level. And we're going to follow those same principles that we followed a moment ago with attitude power trim to begin to hand fly the ILS. So we've got the lateral guidance here and the vertical guidance on the right hand side of the PFD. We're currently level at 2,000 feet, and we're going to want to begin to allow our aeroplane to decelerate to around 160 knots because we're closing in now on 8 miles, and at that point we want to reduce our speed to 160 knots until about 4 DME roughly. There's no auto thrust in this, it can be a bit tricky, but we're going to also follow the same flap and gear extension principles that we would follow ordinarily anyway with the ATR. So with that in mind, allowing that speed to kind of trickle away a little bit, glide slope's about to go active for us, so we're going to turn the yaw damper off and disengage the autopilot. The aeroplane's already trimmed itself to hold our rough speed of 170 or so knots and 2,000 feet. So to maintain that, we might need to just add a little bit of power at 160 knots, and we're going to go gear down. A little bit bumpy. Control visualizer on the left hand side, the bottom left of your screen, so you can see the control inputs we're making. And we're going to try and follow the flight director and our vertical and lateral guidance for the ILS. Not the best weather for this, because it is showing around 10 to 15 knot gusts, but ordinarily it's all fine. So we've gone gear down, flap 15, gear down's 3 green. Pointless trimming at the moment because we're transient. We're doing a whole lot of things to the aeroplane, making the aerodynamics of the aeroplane change. I know I'm not flying the ILS particularly well here, but that's because I'm trying to explain stuff as we go as well, and that's challenging at best. Anyway, we're going to let the aeroplane settle in. And to hold that now, just to kind of assist us, I've let go of the controls, I've trimmed accordingly, I have a slightly higher rate of descent than what I would want otherwise. Pitch for speed, power for the rate of descent. I'm already on idle, so I'm just pitching down slightly. Through 150 knots, flap 30. Pitch for speed, leaving it on idle at the moment. I'm trying to increase that rate of deceleration by increasing the pitch up slightly towards that horizon. And as it starts to capture the speed we want to target, add in a little bit of power as well, because we're going to be increasing the pitch to fly the glide slope. Once we're settled again, we can let go of the controls. It's holding 120 knots with a few 100 foot per minute, 500 foot per minute, there we go. I've let go. And it gives us a lot less work to do. For example then, we're flying in with this fairly choppy weather. By trimming for pitch and speed, as we've just demonstrated, I can focus on things like rudder inputs, aileron inputs. I can have a little bit more time to check the displays to make sure we're on both the lateral and vertical guidance nicely for the approach, and speeds on profile too. And I can look at all of the other things, flap 30, gear down 3 green and locked, to think about the approach. Things have changed slightly, so just going to retrim.
Approaching minimum.
A little bit bumpy, but in effect I can let go.
Minimum. 200 minimum.
And let the aeroplane continue to fly itself down to the threshold of the runway. Just having to be proactive with managing the aileron, but the trim
100.
is sorting the pitch out for us because we've trimmed the aeroplane nicely. Now, as always, looking to the end of the runway,
30.
the depth perception,
20.
holding that picture for the flare. We're letting the aeroplane fly itself to the ground, like so. Gently lower the nose, and if we're going to use reverse prop, we can use reverse prop then too. And that's it. Trim in the Sobo ATR72-600 for Microsoft Flight Simulator. Hope you guys have found the video useful. I know it's something we've been discussing in Discord over the last few days at great length as well. And the principles for this will apply across the various aircraft in your hangar, from the small props like the Cessna 152, the PA-28, all the way through to things like the BA-146, the Aerosoft CRJ, this, the ATR72, and its smaller version, the ATR42, and also the bigger airliners like the 737. Give it a go. I hope you found it useful. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe before you head off. And stay tuned for some future live streams. In the meantime, as always, thank you very much for flying along and watching. And I'll see you next time. Take care.